Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. This one is going to be a very interesting challenge for me because ordinarily I'm the person doing the interviewing. But today I've decided to put myself in the firing line, and I've invited two or three friends of mine who have been involved in my work in one way or another for quite a few years. Both of them are interested in my work for slightly different angles and different ways. Now, we're also hoping that the third member of the group might be joining us later. At the moment, it's been a slight delay on somebody coming in from the United States, but we'll keep our fingers crossed on that. The two people that will be asking me questions today on my writings is Amanda Radcliffe, who is a friend of mine from Wirral. And as you will know, I've interviewed Amanda on a couple of occasions on the show. And you will know that Amanda's life has been absolutely extraordinary. And the things she's been involved in recent years is beyond comprehension. It's quite staggering, the things that have been involved in Amanda's life. And I would argue that Amanda's life very much is evidence of my own Cheating the Ferryman hypothesis. Now, on top of that, also today, we're going to be joined by Tim Bragg, who is a musician, a drummer, and a fellow graduate of Warwick University. I've known Tim for many, many years, and he's been very active on my YouTube, my Facebook site and everything else. And I've always wanted to chat to him about areas of mutual interest, because I know that Tim himself has had a series of extraordinary incidents in his life as well. So without further ado, what I think we'll do is to start off with is just if both of my interrogators, my inquisitors, as it were, can probably explain a little bit about themselves and also how they came across my work, because I think that's quite important as well. And if we can start maybe with Amanda, because your story of discovering my work and my books is amazing. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came across my work.
Okay. Well, I've been living in France for the last 7 years, as people will know. And I ended up in Montségur in the south of France, studying the history of the Cathars after becoming ordained in the French Gnostic Church, and then became involved in working as the witchcraft, occult and esoteric consultant on the Hollywood film Color Out of Space with Richard Stanley. Obviously, your viewers will already know all of this if they've seen our talks. And of course, I knew you, Anthony, about 10 years ago, I think it was, when I found your book in Earlston Library, and it literally jumped off the shelf in front of me. And this was at a time in my life before I had really, how can I put it, accepted the reality of the person that I am. And I was still trying to be normal very much, which never works out very well. And so this book flew off the shelf and literally landed at my feet. And then when I opened it, it said, "You have to tell me the line, Anthony, because I can't remember, but I paraphrase." It was something like, if you're reading this book, it isn't a coincidence. And every incident of your life has led up to you reading this book at this point. Something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, it was generally the idea of we all make choices in our lives, and each choice makes us move into what I would argue is a different version of reality. And we're honing ourselves all the time to end up in a particular point in time and space. And these are not coincidences. They're putting you into the position of encountering the wonders of the universe, I think. And I think that was what happened to you there, wasn't it?
Yeah, it did. I saw that and I thought, okay, I can't really ignore this as a sign. And so I took the book out and read it in the course of the whole weekend. I read the whole book and then immediately thought to myself, I have to find this man, this author, because the book was The Daemon, by the way, which is the only book I think that I've read of yours apart from It Lad. So obviously we've become friends since then, and I started to attend the Walker meetings when I was in England. But the book really spoke to me because as a lifelong clairvoyant and from a family of clairvoyants, and having a mother who had precognitive dreams since I was a child, and always about something disastrous like aircraft disasters. I think I told you that, Tony. So suddenly seeing all of this laid out in The Daemon and applying it to my own life, how my own life had gone up until that point, it made so much sense to me that I had to find this author and write to him. Little did I know that he was actually living on the Wirral at that time, as I was back then. And so I contacted you on Facebook, I think, very surprised that you replied. And then you said, oh yeah, I'm actually running this group in Liverpool. Do you want to come? So that's how it started for me. And then I came to a few of your talks, didn't I?
You
about
did.
the Damon. I don't know if you remember. And attended the Walker group, and then life took me down a different path and I ended up going to France. But we stayed in contact. And then I think when I was making Colour Out of Space, I think that's when we did our first interview, didn't it? It wasn't it, I think. A little bit after I made Colour Out of Space with Richard, yeah.
Absolutely.
And obviously at that time, by the way, I'd had all those experiences with the White Lady and the things that I've talked to you about. So yeah.
Yeah, because there's so much we can pursue on that. And of course, there was the wonderfully interesting day we had when the actress Margie Clark interviewed me at my home in Spittal on the Wirral, which again was an extraordinary day. And I still watch that interview with Margie because she asked some very, very interesting questions, I thought. And if anybody's interested, that is still available. I think she interviewed me for about 2 hours. And it was wonderful piece of filming as well. I mean, the guys that did it was Steve and
Dennis.
And Dennis, absolutely. It was
Logic
really good.
Reality. Yeah, Logic Reality.
So look up Logic Reality on YouTube and you'll find the interview there. Now, moving across then to Tim, our friend over in France. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement and how you discovered my bizarre world and my bizarre writings.
Okay, well, about myself, I'm a musician, multi-instrumentalist, actually, Tony. Started off as a drummer and gradually incorporated the musical instruments, teaching myself, and also a writer, as you know. And I've also always been interested in things esoteric. It goes right back, to. I suppose I've always wanted the shortcut though, because I remember going right back, way back, and doing Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, the Buddhist mantra, Nichiren Buddhist mantra. But always interested in things beyond, beyond this life, as it were. And in fact, the first little story, I was reminded about this, talking to someone, the first little story, the idea I had at school was about a devoutly religious chap, who discovers he's a robot. Right. It's probably not a bestseller, but I was very young. And then, I don't know why, but I suppose when I went to Waterstones or places like that, I'd gravitate, apart from the literature, parts, I'd gravitate to mind, body, and spirit. And I'm not sure what happened here. I got a book called Thinking of an Elephant, which I've never finished. It was great. I was really enjoying it, but I never finished it. And I'm not sure if I was in Waterstones in Leamington Spa and talking to the chap and asking him to recommend stuff, whether he recommended that or recommended Is a Life After Death or whatever happened. I went to the mind, body, spirit, book things, and your book was there, which I don't know how pleased you were about that, it being in the mind, body, spirit. I think it's great. And I actually read it, because we bought the house in France in 2006. We didn't live there. We bought it, and I remember this because I was outside in the sunlight reading It Lad, Is a Life After Death, The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die, or something like that. Sorry, Tony.
Yeah,
and
right.
It was the last time I could read outside in sunlight without glasses. Just a little curious. Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die. I think that's it, isn't it? Yeah.
It was indeed. And funnily enough, I think on 2 occasions I've spoken in Leamington Spa. Okay. Was it Leamington? No, it would have been Warwick, not rather than Leamington Spa.
Oh, no, Warwick. I live near Warwick as well. Yeah.
Ah, right. Because the Unitarians, the very interesting religious group, I always have great admiration for the Unitarians because they seem to be the most sensible of religions, and they have their own parapsychological research group. And every year they have an annual conference, which takes place in the High Street in Warwick. Right, and it was really nice to go back to that area anyway, because I loved that area, because, you know, it was my time when I was at university, I really loved. And there's a very interesting area that, I mean, there's a lot of people are very interested in esoteric matters as well. It does seem that Warwickshire seems to have that kind of feeling about it. I mean, because, for instance, many years ago, we discovered a haunted pub. Myself and a friend of mine, Bob Steen, discovered a haunted pub in Long Itchington, just outside Leamington. And there's a pub called the Blue Lias. Do you know it?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Okay. Now, the Blue Lias is a fascinating... Pardon?
Near the canal, I think, isn't it?
Absolutely, right next to the canal. Absolutely. Now, the Blue Lias is quite fascinating in that we discovered it in a book on ghosts, UK ghosts. I think it was written by Elliot O'Donnell. And we drove out one November evening in the mist from the Warwick campus outside Coventry over to Long Itchington. And we found this pub, and it was really weird because we drove through the mist, you know, sort of autumn weather. We find the pub and we get to the car park, and in the mist, you could see a shape in the background. And it was an old Gloucester Whittle fighter jet. And there was also a model of a Brontosaurus in the car park. And of course, the Blue Lias, their symbol is the Brontosaurus because it's a geological structure. And we went inside, and the pub at that time was run by a guy called Sandy Powell. And it was absolutely full of RAF photographs. And he was an old Second World War fighter pilot. And he was like a mixture of Terry Thomas, and I can't think of who else, but he was an incredible character. And he informed us that, oh, yes, the pub was profoundly haunted. And they discovered this quite by chance, because what happened was their daughter started waking up at night and they could hear her chatting to somebody. And she was about 4 or 5 years of age. And they then asked her one day, who are you talking to? And she said, oh, it's the red-haired boy that sits at the bottom of my bed and he talks to me. And they thought, this is a bit strange. So they went to ask the people in the village about the legend. And it used to be an old farmhouse. And believe it or not, in the bedroom that the little girl was sleeping, there had been a murder that had taken place about 150 years before, where one of the farmhands was having an affair with the farmer's wife, and he caught him and he killed him, he shot him, and he had red hair. Now, we then discovered there was a coal spot in that room, and we tested it out. And yes, there was definitely a place in that room. There was a cold spot. Now, the curious thing is, roll forward around about 20 years, I went back to that pub. Well, actually, I went back to that pub last Christmas, funnily enough. I stayed in Kenilworth, but it's another side story. But when we arrived at the pub about 20 years ago, they knocked a lot of the inside of the pub down. So it was completely open. So the upstairs had gone to give it a much higher roof level. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder if that coal spot still hangs down from the roof for about 6 or 7 feet and then stops where the old floor level was. Very intriguing idea, I think, in terms of that.
Your Sandy Powell, he probably looks a bit like Jimmy Edwards, maybe.
That's it. Jimmy Edwards was the other person. Yeah. I remember once we turned up and the pub was half empty. Well, it was empty because it was empty a lot of the time. And we went in there and we couldn't find him, wondered where he was. And then we called him, and suddenly this hand came up to the top of the bar, and he was actually sleeping underneath the bar. And it was like a ghost was rising up from behind the bar. Wonderful, wonderful memories. Absolutely wonderful times. But
regarding Warwick,
I have a question.
Yeah.
What's your take on ghosts, Tony? I mean, in your theory. Right. In your theory, plural.
Okay, well, I think in terms of ghosts, I've been long intrigued in ghosts. And in fact, as you know from our discussions, our private discussions, what my first interest was very much hauntings and ghosts and UFO encounters. And that was the thing that drew me into parapsychology when I was about 10 or 11 years of age. And ghosts have always intrigued me as to what they actually are. Now, I'm very much a follower of what I would call the stone, well, it's not what I call it, but it's generally known as the stone tapes theory. Remember Nigel Neal, the guy that did a group of very, very influential TV and radio programs in the 1950s and 1960s. He wrote a TV program called The Stone Tape. And Nigel Neal was the guy responsible for, among other things, Quatermass and the Pit, the Quatermass experiment. And the stone tapes theory is the idea that life is energy and emotion is energy, and we give off a form of energy which Wilhelm Reich, the German-American scientist, called orgone energy. And orgone energy is energy that we give off when we're frightened, when we're scared, when we are emotional. And this energy manifests, and I'd argue that most people watching this program would know the set of circumstances where you walk into a room and people have been arguing. You come home from school and your parents have been arguing. You can sense the atmosphere. You just know that people are in an emotional state. Now, the stone tape theory argues that when somebody's in a period of great stress or emotional stress or whatever, the energy comes out of their body and it imbues itself into the environment around it. It literally goes into the stones, goes into the trees or whatever's around it. And in certain atmospheric conditions, those things can re-manifest like a recording. Now, I know of so many cases of this. Like, for instance, there was a very famous case in the mid-1950s, I think it was, where two ladies were staying in Dieppe in northern France. And they woke up in the middle of the night to hear men screaming and explosions and everything else. And it was the Dieppe landings that had taken place in the Second World War. Now, this would explain many hauntings because ghosts seem to follow same patterns. They move in the same way. And also, as many classic hauntings have said, the ghost will walk on the floor level that would have been at the time they existed. So sometimes, I mean, there's a classic case that took place in York where a legionnaire, a Roman legionnaire, was seen in a building. And what they noticed was that his body was half underneath the floor because the floor level would have been different at that time. So to me, hauntings are a much more interesting phenomenon. And again, there is a mutual friend of ours called Paul Eno, who's been on this show. And Paul cited a fascinating case many years ago where he was investigating hauntings in Rhode Island, where he lives. And they were in one location where they could hear people all around them speaking in a strange language, and they could hear noises of cartwheels on tracks. And they checked the language they were hearing, and it was Welsh. And they did some research, and they discovered that, in fact, in the 1750s, 1760s, a lot of Welsh people had moved to that part of America, and they would be speaking to each other in Welsh. So it was like almost a time slip. So in general, I think ghosts are very much part of the energy that surrounds us. Yeah, I believe. But excellent question. By the way, just saying thank you. Hello to David Warman, who's contacting us from Aberdeen in Scotland. Thanks for joining in, David. Also, Elma Diam in La Paz, in Lima in Peru as well, which is wonderful. And also a guy called Abdul Ibru, who's had a paranormal experience himself. So really good. So the messages are coming through, which is really excellent. So,
Tony, can I just, before we leave it, which is a connection to our, we both went to Warwick University. I'm not sure we said that on air or not. And there were some friends of mine that were doing, I guess they would be doing things like, I don't know, mathematics or physics, because they were that way inclined. Amazing chaps. But one of them was, he sang in a band, right? And I remember they used to get dressed up, and they used to perform at the, was it the Globe at the bottom end of Leamington? I should remember that. It's a really rough place at the bottom end of Leamington anyway. And and one of the songs they did was The Witches of Warwickshire. Okay. Now, I used to live in a place called Lodge Farm. And so we, as a band, we used to live there. There was a married couple in the band, and they had one of the cottages, and we, the three single chaps, had a cottage where we used to live in as well. It was like terraced as well. It was kind of, it was hard to describe, but there was the farm, and there's all these kind of workshops and cottages, and I suppose would be for the labourers at one point. Anyway, this is true, okay, because well, it's true, and it was on Halloween, right? And I was outside, and across the way from where we were, there was a valley, so there was a hill opposite, and I remember hearing just about every sound you could possibly hear of every animal and strangeness, and sort of, human noises and that, but it was really very odd, and it went on for some time, okay? Later on that evening, it was so dark that I managed to walk across the courtyard from the married couple's house to our house and walk straight into the band van and cut my head open. Also, where we were in that I had my room. I mean, it was incredible. Living there was incredible. There'd be like ice in the sink in the morning. It was like going back to the 18th century or something. It wasn't. It was later than that. But it was, the conditions of living there. But one day I woke up and all the cupboards in my room, which you'd have to get a stepladder to open them. You couldn't even reach up to them. They were all wide open, big, massive cupboards, right? Unusual, right? And I never did anything with them, because it was so high up, all open, which was odd to say the least. There was a few little odd happenings there, but the first one, because you mentioned about witchcraft in Warwickshire, made me think of that.
Mm. Yes, I mean it is. I think our issue always is that. Because we live in an existence now where we live inside boxes all the time, we never really interface outside. We never sleep in the open air. We never place ourselves looking up at the sky at night. Now, and I think when we do this, we suddenly feel the telluric forces that are around us, and we sense something greater. And I know, Amanda, your experiences in the south of France with the White Lady and everything, that just because we don't experience these things doesn't mean they're not out there all the time. It's just that our minds aren't open to them, I think.
Yeah. Well, recently, as you know, I've become aware of other people having had experiences similar to mine with the White Lady, most notably a man called Christopher Bledsoe in America, who, before the White Lady manifested to him, was having what we could call UFO phenomenon. And that's always been an area that I've never sort of wanted to delve into. I've always looked at it from more of the mystical spiritualist point of view, and I've always understood the White Lady as being an interdimensional being, but I never fully understood why she manifested to me or what it was about. I mean, I think I said to you recently, Anthony, I've had 7 encounters with her now. And Chris and I recently made contact as a result of all of the synchronicities that have been happening that I've been speaking about with you privately. And the reason I mention this is because I started to look into, having realized that some people like Chris, who are more in the UFO community and who've been scientifically investigated by the US government as well, and discovered to be legitimate, have had similar experiences. And so I've been looking into the work of Whitley Strieber, and one of the things that he said, of course you're connected with him, you've been on his show, that resonated with me is that in one of his books he says, if you have contact coming into your house then that you don't want, turn on electricals, turn on the light, turn on the radio, turn on television. And so what you said there about us living inside boxes and we're not outside engaging with these things in the way we would have in the past, I think that really is true, because when Richard and I were walking up the mountain in Montsegur one evening, we were experiencing a lot of things and I was getting quite scared. It was nighttime. And he said, just turn on your torch or turn on your mobile phone and you'll see it will change everything. And it did. And what I think happens, because Montségur and that whole area in the south of France where I've been living is very rich in telluric currents and geomagnetic activity. And I think these phenomena, whatever they are, need certain conditions in order to manifest. For example, I can't imagine the white lady manifesting in an urban environment, you know, in the same way, with the same power and intensity. I also wonder if these beings draw on the energy, the energies, the geomagnetic, telluric, even perhaps astronomical energies, or the moonlight seems to be very implicated in the encounters with the lady that myself and others have had. You know, some of us wonder if she even crystallizes the moonlight in some way. Or, as we discussed on the phone, maybe it's also plasma. We just don't know. We don't know. But one thing is sure, that these beings are manifesting. And I think your talk there about how we don't interact with these beings that often nowadays is because we are inside and we're surrounded by electrical interference.
I think that's a very, very profoundly important statement, because anybody out there who's read my book, The Hidden Universe, that's one of the central concepts I discuss. Because as a bit of a background here in terms of my own writing and my own progression in terms of writing my books, as many of you will know, I originally wrote Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die, way back in 1999, 2000. And then that was when I first came up with the concept of cheating the ferryman. And the reason I didn't use the term cheating the ferryman at the time was because my publisher didn't like it. They felt that people would get confused, which I found quite insulting, because I think that is assuming stupidity or lack of knowledge of your readership. People know what I mean by cheating the ferryman, but they decided to call it Is There Life After Death, which of course frustrated the life out of me, because my hypothesis has got nothing to do with life after death. It's what happens in the final seconds before you die. So already the book was misleading. And a lot of people did say they felt that the title was misleading. But what has happened over the years is then I wrote that book. I had an academic paper published in 2005 by the International Association of Near-Death Studies on the subject of cheating the ferryman. And then I wrote Cheating the Ferryman. And since then, I've been expanding the ideas out. And one of the major areas I've been fascinated by is the role of entities. What exactly are these entities? Are they independent of us? Or are they somehow manifestations that use us to come into this reality in some way? And I know from having long discussions with people like Paul Eno, is, as Amanda, you mentioned there before, that I think there is a linkage here somewhere with plasma. And in the book, The Hidden Universe, which I wrote in 2019, what I argue is that we have historical precedent for this. Way back, for instance, in when the Quran was being written, the holy book of Islam, one of the things they said then was that there were three different types of entities, and the angels were made out of light, and mankind was made out of mud. And there was another entity called the jinn that were made out of smokeless fire. And as soon as I came across the term smokeless fire, I thought, that's plasma, because scientifically, plasma is another form of matter. The sun is made of plasma, and plasma is a form of energy. Now, could it be that these entities they feed off us in some way? They need our fear in order to manifest. And that's why ghosts do what they do, because they need this fear factor. But then the question is, are we creating them out of our imagination? And I'd argue, yes, we are, but we're misunderstanding what the word imagination means. In this, I'm using the term the mundus imaginalis, the writings of people like the French mystic Henri Corbin, who wrote a lot about the imaginal, and the idea that there's a relationship between our imagination and the imaginal, and we create the imaginal. And this is where the term egregores come from. I use the term egregorus, which is Latin for watchers. But I argue that egregores are created by us. They're related to tulpas. And also something that we were discussing recently, I think is intriguing as well, is the relationship between these entities and darkness. It seems that they need darkness in order to manifest. And I think this is directly to do neurologically with the brain, and particularly the brain's pineal gland's creation of melatonin. Because as you know, melatonin is the enzyme that makes us go to sleep, which is secreted by the pineal gland. Now, in the book, I point out certain things, like there are a group of children called the Mamas I think it's in Ecuador. And these are indigenous peoples who take children, very young children, who they believe have potential to become shamans, and they place them in darkness until they are 10, 11 years of age. And they never see natural light. And they then can hallucinate at will. And I think this is, again, because they're able to control the mechanism by which the pineal gland not only secretes melatonin, but synthesizes melatonin into an endogenous, internally generated chemical, which we call metatonin, which I argue is exactly the same as DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And that what is happening here is we are creating our own dimethyltryptamine within darkness. And I think this is where, again, ghosts may be. So ghosts, I think, answering your question in a long way from before, are both a manifestation of these stone tape theory. But there's also another phenomenon taking place, which is related to it, which is quasi-independent of us, that is part of the DMT world. And this is why people encounter DMT entities. And then finally, I think there's a link directly here to dreaming, to lucid dreaming, to out-of-body experiences, because I think they're all facilitated and manifested by the same things.
And that links in with Cheating the Ferryman, because it could be that when the Edelan lives its life again, that could be imagination, right? So I'd like to, at some point, discuss the nature of the consciousness of the Edelan when we get to it.
Okay.
Can I just get back to a couple of things that you said briefly? Is that okay, Tim?
Yes, yeah.
I just wanted to say that not all of these entities are negative. Like the White Lady experiences have never been negative for anyone who's had them. If anything, it's been a life-changing, positive experience. There has, of course, been, the stigma about having these experiences and knowing what to do with them and having no context for them. But overwhelmingly, they have been positive experiences. And speaking with briefly recently with people involved in this field, it seems as if, and I think we said this on the phone, there are two different types. There are maybe entities that are more on the dark side, so to speak, and then ones that are more on the light side. And in my own kind of understanding, they do seem to have some kind of independent existence, in that the ones that Chris and I saw physically manifested. So it's not like perceiving something psychically, which could be coming from any, it could be, as you say, the imaginal realm. It seems like some of these beings have a way of utilizing some kind of energy in order to physically manifest. And those White Lady experiences are overwhelmingly positive. I just wanted to point that out. And equally, the darkness, the first time I had a White Lady experience, it did happen at night at 3 a.m. and that was the same for Chris. And it was in a very, how can I put it, natural and wild environment in each of our cases when she manifested. And a friend had a manifestation with her recently, and that was in the wilds of Scotland. And it was the same kind of MO, that we were woken up at 3 a.m. from a dream about a bright white light, and then the physical manifestation happened in the bedroom. In Chris Bledsoe's case, it was other beings that woke him up, and then he was led physically out of the house into the forest where she physically manifested. And so again, it's the nature, like you say, there's something about nature and the energies involved in wild nature, I think, that these particular types of beings need. I think orbs and things like that, I have no knowledge of. I have never experienced an orb. but certainly it could be plasma, like you said. But I think there are other entities, and this is something Chris Bledsoe speaks about as well, which are negative and do feed on our fear. And in his experience with the lady, she actually speaks about this. And she says we must overcome our fear, because, you know, the darkness wants our fear. And the way the world is going at the moment, we only need to look at how much fear has been put into all of us over the last couple of years. And so I think, you know, what you said there about those entities is really important.
I think it's a very good point, and the idea that, you know, that there is a negative side and a positive side to this, and I think it's profoundly important that we don't all get carried away and think, oh, you know, sort of out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences are all positive. They're not, and some of them are very dangerous and very problematical. But by the same token, there is a positive side as well. It's like everything else, you know, there are shades of black and white in everything. Now, for me, my starting point is always science. It always has been the science and always will remain the science. Then we use the science to explain the experiences that people have. And I think that there are too many reports of these experiences to just dismiss them. And I get very irritated when people dismiss them and use the catch-all phrase, they're hallucinations. And people who know me know that I have this terminology I use here, in that if I hallucinate something, that's an hallucination. If you and I share an hallucination, that's a folie à deux. And they seemingly claim they've explained it by using something else that they can't explain, which effectively suggests telepathy when two people see the same thing external to themselves. And then when you have a group of people seeing something, as people did say at Fatima in 1917, when they saw the sun spin in the sky, that was a mass hallucination. But that doesn't explain anything. It's just label theory. It's just giving it a label. And it's a nice label theory, you know, give it a nice Latin phrase or a Greek phrase, and that will then bedazzle people. I call it idiomatic science, because, of course, the word idiomatic, you know, idiopathic, sorry. So idiopathic science. So when somebody is told you have idiopathic epilepsy, you go away and you think, oh, it's been diagnosed. The word idiopathic means we don't know. That's the whole meaning of the word idiopathic. And I think we have idiopathic science. You know, an idio is, you know, the root of the word idiot and also the root of the word eidolon as well. So we have lots of phonetic wordology here in terms of semantics, but it's profoundly important that we make that point. These things do happen, and to just pretend they don't is bad science. We have to explain them. And the only way, and for instance, as a final point here, when we say that people have hallucinations, everything is an hallucination. Everything we perceive is brain generated. Every single thing we perceive. We do not interface directly with the external world at all. We never ever touch anything. Even the fact you think you're sitting on your chair now, you're not. You're hovering above the chair, and your bottom is hovering above the chair. And what makes you feel that you're in contact is something called electrostatic repulsion. But we never touch anything. We never actually really see anything. What we see is the messages and the signals created in our retina at the back of our eye from photons hitting our retina. But the photons that hit our retina are not the photons, not the signals that then go to the visual cortex of the brain. The visual cortex of the brain recreates from these signals a model of what the external visual world looks like. And then we believe that that is it. And as a final point, and people find this hard to accept, there ain't no color out there. Color does not exist. There's no such thing as red, green, or blue. They are just vibration states of the electromagnetic spectrum, light, that our brain interprets being a particular color. So there's a particular part of the electromagnetic spectrum that stimulates our brain to see red. There is no red anywhere. And when you start to realize that, suddenly hallucinations suddenly become far more interesting and far more intriguing. Tim, put it over to you. Any questions, thoughts?
Well, can we bring in Cheating the Ferryman at this point?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to give the readers some sense of,
By the way, just to say I say hi to a friend of mine, Noreen from Wirral, who's watching in as well. So just to say hi to Noreen, one of my oldest friends. So,
okay,
sorry, Tim, go on.
Yeah. So first of all, which I'd like to come back to, is that the introduction, which looks at the personality, the consciousness, and the epileptic fit, which is life between two voids, or the void between two epileptic fits. I think you do also describe it as, or someone has, is the
Goncourt. It was the Goncourt brothers.
That's it. Yeah.
Life is a nothing between two epileptic fits.
Yes. Yeah. So that is the annihilation of the personality. Okay. So we live this life, and that's it. Okay. And then you've got your ideas of heaven and hell. Okay. Which are quite limited in one sense. Because obviously, you know that I read Swedenborg, and
yes,
that opens up a completely different idea of what hell and heaven is. And it'll be quite surprising to people. And in fact, I've got a great quote from Borges I'd like to read at some point about.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm going to do it now, Tony, right? While I've got my specs on, right? And this is Borges talking about it. And he says, and it's interesting because he says, like the Buddha, Swedenborg rejected asceticism, which impoverishes men and diminishes them. Within the boundaries of heaven, he saw a hermit who had set out to gain admittance, to gain admittance there, and had voluntarily spent his mortal life in the solitude of the desert. Okay, so he'd be like an ascetic. Having reached his goal, the Blessed One discovers that he is unable to follow the conversations of the angels or fathom the complexities of paradise, heaven. He is finally permitted to project around himself an hallucinatory image of the wilderness. There he remains, as he did on earth, engaged in self-denial and prayer, but without the hope of reaching heaven, which brings in a whole lot of stuff, all right? But maybe we'll leave that floating about for the moment, okay? So you've got reincarnation and Cheating the Ferryman, all right? And I'm really going to perhaps, I would like to challenge you on the differences between reincarnation and Cheating the Ferryman, and just wondering whether it's some extent semantic, all right? But if we get a chance, we'll go into that.
Yeah, absolutely.
The three major elements of the book I've got down to: the nature of consciousness. That's imperative, okay? That's the main thing, the nature of consciousness. Then the nature of time, okay? Because, and I've read the Labyrinth of Time and everything. And time, for me, is always the key to everything, right? The key to this life, the key to any other following lives, if they exist. And then the nature of reality, which is the wave particle potential reality, collapsing the wave or not into the particle, and the subatomic world in general. Okay. So, I mean, that's where I was coming from.
Okay. Well, can I come in here? The first one is that it's quite interesting about Swedenborg, in that I regularly go to the Swedenborg Society, and funnily enough, I did a formal debate there a few years ago with scientists on the nature of consciousness. One of the things I find interesting is the Swedenborg magazine I picked up when I was there, and it was interesting. This one had an article on the links between the movie Jacob's Ladder and Swedenborg. And if you know the movie Jacob's Ladder, you know that what happens is the guy in the film has a series of really wild hallucinations. He's having these hallucinations all the time. And what is happening is he's literally having an end-of-life near-death experience where he's reliving his life again. And the article takes very much a Cheating the Ferryman viewpoint of this, and saying that there must be hallucinatory states that we go into between life and death. Now, in Tibetan Buddhism, we have the term the bardo and the bardo state. And I know that Swedenborg was very much interested in the concept of the bardo state. Now, just to clarify most precisely here, Cheating the Ferryman is what happens to human consciousness, or my hypothesis. Do I believe it? I don't know. All I know is that the science tells me this is what's pointing it towards. So when people turn around and say Anthony Peake believes this, I don't believe it. It's what the science is telling me. It's suggestive of this hypothesis. Now, if we live many, many lives, hundreds of lives in the final seconds before we die, in a timeless zone, which, as you know, I discuss in my book, The Labyrinth of Time, and I do the physics of how this can happen, that you live all these lives in those final seconds, and then you do die. And when you do die, I have no idea what happens to you. You could reincarnate as somebody else. You could, in which case reincarnation is true. You could go and live in heaven, as some people believe, or you could cease to exist completely. Now, as you know, in the opening chapter of the book, I discuss all of those options and give logical reasons to why I think that they are possibly make no logical sense. But it doesn't mean they don't happen. It means, for me, they don't make logical sense. Like, for instance, for me, reincarnation and the concept of karma only works if you remember the fact of what happened in your previous life. Because if you don't remember it, how can you ever learn from your mistakes? How can you ever develop if you have a continual series of incarnations, each of which is unique from the previous one, and the memories are not carried forward? So in which case, you for instance, within karma, if I have an evil life and I'm reborn in a lower form of life, or I'm reborn as an untouchable or whatever, because I'm being punished for what I did in my previous life. But if I don't know, A, that I'm being punished, because I don't know I'm being punished, I just know I'm an untouchable, and B, I have no memories of what I did wrong, I can't learn. You can only learn by remembering. And this is where I argue, this is where Cheating the Ferryman is different. Cheating the Ferryman says there is a part of you that does remember your previous life. It's called your daemon. And your daemon is your immortal you who carries inside your consciousness that awareness, because it is you. So in the present life, your eidolon is unaware of your previous lives, because it has to be, because it has to live this life independently. But the daemon can guide you within this life. So that's why I have issues with reincarnation. Doesn't mean I don't believe in it. I just have logical issues. Go on, Tim. Yeah.
No, I agree. I absolutely agree with you there. And it's kind of like be yo-yoing. So like you do things wrong in your life, so you have to you're reincarnated to put those right. Then you do things right. You're reincarnated to a higher level. But because you live at a higher level, perhaps a very rich man, you do things that are not good, and you come down again. But of course, you talk about the daemon here. This is very interesting because I started to have this idea. Well, there's Menski's idea of the super consciousness. Okay, and Marvin
Minsky. Yeah.
And I was, when I said that stuff I wrote to you, I was thinking about the daemon becoming a super conscious, a greater. So I think I called it the greater daemon. Okay, but there could be a link between what is meant by the soul and the daemon. So at the beginning, we have the daemon, and the beginning was the word. The beginning was the daemon and the eidolon, the first eidolon. Okay. So there's also questions about that, which is where did they come from? But let's leave all that aside, okay? And the first life is lived, and they live it together, and it's everything that happens, okay? And that defines that life that is to be relived, okay? Second eidolon, and you talk about the halving of time as death becomes closer, right? Which I get. Thomson's lamp is a great example of that. And in that time where effectively the eidolon A drops out of time, okay, this time, I mean, first of all, does he have a life review? I don't know. Does he have a near-death experience? I don't know. But something then goes back into the womb and relives that life again, okay? Now, is that something that, so we're still, if you like, eidolon A, okay? Edelin A. I say Edelin, but I don't even get it right. But I'll just say that, so I'll keep saying it. Edelin A. So the consciousness, his consciousness, or its consciousness is fallen out of time, close to death. All right, and there's the glutamine wash in the brain and all this kind of business going on. Now then, which is why I talked about imagination. I don't know, this could be imagination, but there's another consciousness then that lives the life of Edelin A. I'll call that Edelin B. Right, Edelin B is still inside Edelin A, is it not?
No, I would argue, again, it's only, you know, how I pull it together, is that each Eidolon, I do the same. I swap and change depending upon my mood. Each Eidolon lives one life and dies. And I've always used the analogy here of a third-person RPG game. So imagine a scenario. You switch on a computer game. You fire it up and you fire up the environment, which is created from digital information that's processed in the computer. And of course, in the book, I argue that we are living within a digital mathematical simulation. So the simulation is fired up and the Eidolon, the first Eidolon, is born. In my opinion, in my example, I use the idea of Lara Croft. So Lara Croft, you switch on Tomb Raider and you have Lara Croft and she's just there. That's an Eidolon. It's born for the first time. The Lara Croft character then runs down a corridor, goes into a room, and gets killed by a monster. That Eidolon is now dead. But what has happened is the game player suddenly has lived one life and knows something about the digital environment that its Eidolon is living in, that the last Eidolon. So suddenly, the daemon is aware that there's a monster in that room. So when the Eidolon dies, a second Eidolon is then created, a second sprite, which is independent of the first one. But the demonic consciousness, which is the game player, carries the information from that last life to use it to guide its Eidolon through the next life. So the daemon doesn't have Lara Croft go into that room because it knows there's a monster. Lara Croft doesn't know, the second Eidolon doesn't know why, but it gets this feeling it shouldn't go into that room. So it doesn't. It goes down the corridor and encounters another monster and gets killed. Second Eidolon dead.
I get this. Yeah.
Okay.
I get this. Okay. Right. So the first Eidolon, right? The first Eidolon is not dead. It isn't dead. Okay, because it's never reaching death. Right now.
Yeah, I see your point. Okay, go on.
So
continue.
If the consciousness, if there's a separate consciousness for Eidolon B, okay, fine, right? But I thought that, or I imagined that for it to work, you'd have to have the life lived again coming from the consciousness of Eidolon A. Okay, so that at this point, when it's born again, it has no remembrance of the consciousness of Eidolon A. Now,
but that's when it becomes a daemon.
Hang on. The daemon, and you argue for this as well. So the daemon, we carry the daemon in our head. It's a separate consciousness in our head. Well, how separate is it? That's the first thing, by the way.
Yeah.
I don't know how separate it is, the relationship between the Eidolon and the daemon. Okay, so and the daemon would be in Eidolon B as much as it was in Eidolon A, but I would say, but does it leave Eidolon A and then B, C, D, E, F? None of them come to the end of their lives. Okay. Now, because they've all fallen out of time, it's like every Eidolon touches another Eidolon, and in fact, the daemon would have to be like a super consciousness. Would have to be a super daemon, a greater daemon, because if we say that all these Eidolons are existing in either the many worlds interpretation, right, or beyond that, isn't it like instead of collapsing the waves, there's a potential still? It's the same thing for me.
Yes, it's very much. I like where you're coming from here, because it's the argument that is used by Stephen Hawking and Frank Hartle in the paper, The Top-Down Hypothesis of Quantum Physics. I mentioned this in the book, and the top-down hypothesis argues that every wave function continues. In that every wave function has the potentiality of many other wave functions, which all exist, but they only exist in potentiality and are collapsed by the act of that wave function collapsing. And they argue that everything that can happen does happen. And all that happens is that, like a searchlight, we illuminate that bit of the mega wave function. Now, your point, I think, is a really good one. And it starts to move into theology here. And at the end of my Cheating the Ferryman book, I go into this, where I argue that we have, and remember, this is an idea that's still developing. And this is why this is great discussion. Somebody who actually is asking questions and understands where I'm coming from here, is that there's the eidolon, which is the singular consciousness. Then there's the daemon, which is the consciousness of many lives. Then you will have what I call the uberdaemon. And the uberdaemon is the equivalent of the Jungian collective unconscious. The uberdaemon is the collective unconsciousness of humanity. And I believe that when people have past lives, and they have hypnotic past lives, or they attune into past lives, what they're actually doing is attuning into the information field of the uberdaemon. So if I hypnotize myself back to a previous life and I'm a medieval peasant, I was never actually that medieval peasant. My daemon eidolon dyad was never that peasant, but my uberdaemon would have been that peasant. So in which case, within the memory banks of the uberdaemon, there are the memories of everybody. Now, on top of that, just to finish, is then what I call the godemon. And the godemon, God daemon, the godemon, is what we would call God in the terms of the equivalent of the Vedantist concept of Brahman, the Orain Sof of the Kabbalists, the idea of the singular consciousness that the Gnostics believed in. And we'd call that God because it is the essence of everything, not just human consciousness, but every consciousness and every living being. And what we are part of, we're part of that greater something. As the famous statement goes, we are a single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, which is exactly what the perennial philosophy of people like Aldous Huxley has argued for years. The idea that we are a singular consciousness. And Cheating the Ferryman is very much the embodiment of that, you embody into the uberdaemon, and then embodies into the daemon, and then embodies into the singular eidolons. But you're quite right. The argument is at the end of every eidolonic life, there will be a panoramic life review. Now, again, this reminds me, again, as you're speaking about this, of, what's his name? J.W. Dunn. And J.W. Dunn's idea of serial time. And in my first book, I discussed the work of J.W. Dunn, because Dunn argues that, and it's very subtle, Dunn's argument, it's beautiful. He turns around and he says, if time flows like a river, as Marcus Aurelius said, it must have something to flow against.
Yeah.
Because if you've just got a river flowing, you need the banks to have a reference to which direction the river's flowing. Yeah. And he argued, so in which case there must be another form of time that time one flows against. So there must be a time two. And if there's a time two, there must be a consciousness in time two, an observer in time two, to observe the flow of time one. But you can very quickly see this becomes an infinite regress.
Yeah.
Because there must be an infinite number of times with an infinite number of observers in them. But it's still a very important point, this, and I discuss this in the labyrinth of time. What does time flow against? If we have this idea, do we flow through time, or does time flow round us? And I came to the same conclusion St. Augustine did. I think I understand time until I think about it. And I spent 380 pages writing a book on time, and I still didn't understand it.
Yeah, and you also, but you have a great idea in Cheating the Ferryman as well. Sorry, and I also I'm going to say something else and then realise I'll shut up a bit. But you talk about advanced waves and retarded waves.
Yeah, the John Kramer.
And where those waves meet is where perhaps the present is found.
Mm.
this is interesting. But back to the consciousness. You see, I was thinking about all this. I'm going crazy, really, Tony. Right?
I spend all the time going crazy.
And you know that thing I sent you, it's about 10 times the length now, and all different ideas came out of stuff. And I kind of want to reference them, but I'm going to try and think on my feet as well. And also, by the way, I've got a question from Wayne. So when you're ready for that. Okay. So I came to this idea that, because you were talking about, which is a really peculiar idea, but fantastic, is that the universe brings about us beings with consciousness, which actually create the universe. So, you know, the universe needs us to bring it into being. And I had this idea, but when I reread as quick as I could, right, reread the book, because I'm a very slow reader, then the idea then that, because you talk about the Big Bang as well, and the Big Bang is neither big, neither is it a bang, right? And I thought, well, we're living in this constantly inflating universe, okay? And I thought, well, maybe it wasn't a Big Bang, it was like I started off with a leak, you know, a leak from somewhere, but an inflation from somewhere. I even got the word breath from somewhere, you know, which took me straight away to God.
Yeah.
But this, where it would come from is one would imagine, and you talk about so many ideas about, you talk about the quarks, for instance, disappear and reappear and what have you. But if it was consciousness, which has no concrete place, has no time, has no concreteness about it, you know, you can't hold a memory, you can't hold a thought, you know. So if it was consciousness, and consciousness gave rise, because consciousness can do anything, as we found out, kind of a circular item, we're going to come up here, but it gives rise to the universe, which gives rise to beings that are able to create the universe in a sense, or recreate it, or in a combination recreation of the universe with the original consciousness, because that consciousness flows through us and we see the universe. It's almost like we are the universe, or the consciousness was searching for us, but then again, everything was in, because the scientists say that everything's in the Big Bang, right? Everything. Well, that must mean that consciousness is in the Big Bang, if it's part of it, unless you take consciousness out of that, and consciousness is everything, and therefore everything comes from consciousness. So yeah, everything comes from consciousness. So the idea that the breath of consciousness, or God, because you could call it God as well, gives rise to the universe, gives rise to us. Our act of observation creates the world that we've been brought up in. It's a bit of a freak out, but that's kind of what you were saying, isn't it? To some extent, parts of that.
It is. It's the idea that that the universe needs consciousness in order to bring itself into existence, and it was very much was the work of somebody called John Archibald Wheeler. And John Archibald Wheeler was, I think, he was the PhD tutor for Richard Feynman, for example, and Wheeler's argument, he calls it the participatory universe. Now, again, for anybody listening in here thinking I'm talking wacko new age nonsense here, John Wheeler was one of the premier cosmologists and physicists of the 21st century. So we're not talking here about the guy down the pub. We're not talking about somebody who's talking to entities from the planet Tharg. We're talking about serious scientists. And Wheeler very much argued that the mystery of the collapse of the wave function, and how it seems that the act of observation brings reality from being a statistical possibility into an actual point particle, the act of measurement. And I always say this to people: if you ever want scientists, including people like Brian Cox, to be spluttering into his beer, just ask him about the consciousness problem and the collapse of the wave function, because they have no idea, okay? They don't. And they pretend they do, but they don't. So the idea is, what is this relationship between either the act of measurement, consciousness, the observer, and reality? And Wheeler did this incredible thought experiment, which I think has now been tried, whereby you can prove, using known science, that you, looking at a quasar that existed, 8-9 billion years ago, you bring that quasar into existence. by your act of observation. And it's something called gravitational lensing. And it's to do with the fact that the light that left the quasar 8 billion years ago, when it gets to the Earth, we have what's called an Einstein cross. And it really confused people at first. They looked at the telescopes and they saw 4 stars, 4 quasars. And they thought, that's strange. They're in a kind of cross shape. And they realized that what was happening was it was the light from one quasar that was being bent around a galaxy. Because as you know, galaxies and things that have large density curve space around them. And by curving the space around them, it means the light waves curve, which means the light waves curve around the galaxy, giving the impression that there are 4 light sources, when in fact there's just one, because the light has been split by the curvature. What he then said was, then imagine you could reproduce the twin slit experiment. You could actually take the 2 light sources and then put them into the 2 light sources through the slits of a twin slit experiment. And if you did that, you'd reproduce the idea that if an observer looks at them, they are particles, but if they're not looked at, they're waves. And these are light waves that are 8 billion years old. And he came to the conclusion, this means that the participation of us within the universe brings about the universe around us. Now, the thing is, if time is the factor that in all my writings, I think people don't get, time is the mystery here.
Yeah.
Time is the issue and the way we structure things. So there is no time, there is no past, present, and future. As Einstein said, it's an illusion, but a very, very strong one. There is no past, present, and future. We know there are subatomic particles that seem to go backwards in time. And I'm not talking about tachyons here, which are theoretical. I'm talking about genuine subatomic particles, which you were talking about, called advanced and retarded waves. And advanced waves are going forwards in time and retarded are going backwards, or vice versa, I never remember, which John Kramer argued, which means that there are 2 forms of light. There are 2 forms of energy. And the point where they come together, the waves coming backwards in time and the waves coming forwards in time, create an interference pattern. And that interference pattern is the nexus point of now. And that interference pattern is what brings about the holographic nature of this reality. And I think I'm the only writer that's pointed that out, because, of course, that's all a hologram is. It's an interference pattern. And our perception is collapsing the wave function of those energy patterns as you're observing the world now. You're creating an interference pattern from your anticipations of what you expect to happen or not to happen. If that makes sense.
Yeah, because this multiple there wasn't that, because I heard it twice. I watched a video of it and it was beyond me. But it's like you're almost attracted to a universe that because your self splits into as many possible potential universes. You become entangled with one of them.
Correct. Now, it's a very important point I want to make here, by the way, is the 2 things. The one thing I mentioned, because we'll bring Amanda in a second as well. Very important that a lot of the model I'm talking about now is directly related to the work of Max Tegmark, the Swedish-American quantum physicist. Now, Tegmark, in the book, I give an example of Tegmark when he was a very young man, was cycling through the center of Copenhagen. And as he was cycling through, he thought that there wasn't going to be many crowds around, so he could just cycle across a junction. But something made him stop. And as he stopped, a juggernaut came past. It was when he was about 11 or 12. And he realized at that point that had he not stopped, he would have been killed. And he made a thought experiment when he got older to say, but there might have been a version of me that was killed at that moment. And there's a version of me that's carried on, not dead. And he then applies this to what he calls the quantum suicide thought experiment. And he uses quantum mechanics and he uses the twin slit experiment and Schrodinger's cat and the concept of Schrodinger's cat to prove we are all immortal. Now, all I do is I was unaware of Tegmark's work when I wrote ItLAD initially. I then came across his work when I was writing the revised version of ItLAD. And in the new book, Cheating the Ferryman, I really take his ideas and develop them and say, Tegmark is quite right. There are multiple universes where we don't die. There's one universe where you will, but in your universe, you will continue to exist because that's your universe needs you to continue to exist. And when I do lectures, I turn around to people in the audience and I say, don't you find it extraordinary that you've seen people die in your life? You're still here. You're always still here because you are the observer. But I'll guarantee in other people's lives, you'll have died. In other people's lives, you died years ago. But you, in your universe, continue to exist because in your universe, you have to exist because your universe needs you to be the observer of that universe. Amanda, I'm throwing it over to you now. Does this make any sense to you?
No, this is going completely over my head. I mean, obviously, I've studied quantum physics to some extent in my transpersonal psychology degree, but no, this is totally over my head, I'm afraid. I would like to say something, though. I wonder if time is related to matter in the sense that, you know, when we incorporate within matter, matter is only available to us for a certain period of time before we go into decay. And it seems to be related to growth cycles as well.
I think it's possibly true. I think the relationship between matter and consciousness is profound because, of course, matter that we think is matter is 99.9999999999996 empty space.
Mm-hmm.
And the bits that are matter are basically quarks and electrons. Everything we see is made out of 6 quarks and electrons in fields. Okay, that's it. All of them are point particles, which means they have no extension in space. However much you zoom into them, they will always be a point particle. But it's that our consciousness creates out of those building blocks this huge reality. Now, there's been a lot of, on the radio and television recently, people got very excited about the fact that Anton Zeilinger and Alain Aspect have jointly won this year's Nobel Prize for Physics. Now, I've been writing about these two guys for the last 20 years. You know, this is not news to me. I've been following their work. I'm delighted now that the rest of the world is waking up. I'm delighted that the BBC are now talking about Zeilinger and Aspect. Again, I sometimes get frustrated because I've been banging on saying, let's read this guy's stuff. It's amazing. But I'm delighted now people are. Because what they've done is they've proved the existence. Well, it was actually proven in 1981, you know, but people just don't know about it. There was an experiment in 1981 which proved something called the EPR paradox, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment, and also subsequently something called Bell's inequality. John Bell was an Irish physicist at CERN, and he basically proved something called superposition and non-locality. In basic terms, what this means is if you take 2 subatomic particles and you place them within the same quantum state, which is a bit complex to explain, but you basically mix them together and then you put them apart, they can be 10 feet apart or 10 billion miles apart. If you do 1-to-1 particle, the other particle will know instantaneously and will react to what you've done, which means that our idea of space and distance is also an illusion. Space is nothing. Space needs things in it. It's what Ernest Mach argued. Now, so the idea, if these 2 subatomic particles are miles apart and they can instantaneously communicate, extrapolate that back to the Big Bang. If every single quark in the universe and every single electron and every single field and consciousness was all in a point particle that was infinitesimally small. Now, we're talking about ridiculously small. We're talking about smallness way beyond even the smallest bit of space we know, the Planck square, even smaller than that. Everything existed then. So if it all existed together, it existed in the same quantum state. And if it existed in the same quantum state, it means that every single subatomic particle in the universe and consciousness are already entangled, which means non-locality is everything, if that makes sense. Tim, does that make sense to you?
Yeah. And I just wanted to say at this point, because I don't know if Amanda's read Cheating the Ferryman, but um, this is a process for people who are not you or are not as you, like you, in this universe. You know, it takes time for us to get used to the terminology and the concepts, which is fine. The thing is, for anyone that is thinking about reading the Cheating the Ferryman, I'd say read it, get it. You won't be disappointed, because it's talking about the big things. It's talking about being, right? And also, which you do look wonderfully, Tony, which I love, is you have a conversational tone. So you engage us. We feel your personality. I'm bigging you up here, that terrible expression. Sorry, anyone listening in. And but you have that tone, but also you explain things really clearly, right? Sometimes, yes, sometimes you're going to have to go back and really kind of read it again. And you know, sometimes we can read stuff, but sort of go with it. But sometimes you've got to read it again and really, what's really meant here. Like when I did it the second time, because my mind was focused, I was like swatting, you know, swatting for this. And look, because my mind was focused, I had to really understand as much as I could. I still realize I'm just a beginner, right? But and when you're talking now, you're able to bring out all these ideas, and you obviously know them completely, you know, like any other word. And I don't want to have chauffeur knowledge, you know. I want to know that I'm what I'm talking about. And but you're really good at that. So I have to say that, because I want people to get this book, and to when they read it, and they probably have to read it a second time, which is fine, twice for the money, you know. But they won't be disappointed. So even the very complex stuff, that's what I want to say. The very complex stuff, you walk us through it hand in hand, you know, and we do get there. Yeah, we might have to read it again, but it's really rewarding, because then when the next thing refers to it, you've got an idea about that, and then you can build your. So I've really kind of expanded my knowledge in a very short amount of time, you know, because of this book. I mean, yeah, it references Is There Life After Death? And I've read, in fact, the bizarre thing is I've read most of your books, right? Apart from the Daemon, which I wanted to read, but I thought you said it was out of print, and it isn't. So I'm going to get it. So that'll challenge a lot of my ideas as well. But yeah.
I think you make a very valid point there. I think it's happened quite a few times when I have, you know, friends who are very interested in my work and have been involved for a decade and a half. And one of my friends came along to one of my talks. It was about the fourth time he'd been along to one of my talks. And he turned around and he said, "Oh my God, I've just got it. I just understand what you mean." He said, "Oh my God." He said, "I had not grasped what you mean." He said, "This is extraordinary. This is the most incredible piece of information I have ever heard in my life." And I think my frustration is, I suppose, quite naturally, I'm the only person probably on the planet that really understands what I'm talking about in detail, because I wrote it. And I think I get very frustrated sometimes and I think it comes down to my lack of skill as a writer, to be able to get across the things in my head in a way that people can understand, because I know how all the bits link in. And I find these days I get very frustrated, because what is happening is there are writers out there, and there's lots of them, and they're really great, but they've only got one tiny bit of it. And I'm writing about all of it. And I get frustrated, you know, when people like, I don't know, who were like Robert Lanza, biocentrism. Biocentrism is considered to be the most extraordinary book that's ever been written. It's unique, it's wonderful. Lanza is a genius and everything else. Lanza does but 1/10 of what I do in Cheating the Ferryman. 1/10 what I did in It Lad. Yes, he focuses in on a small area of the Cheating the Ferryman hypothesis. Then somebody else comes along and writes about the Daemon. And people go, "Whoa, it's really wonderful. He's writing about the Daemon." People like Hillman. And there's another writer, I can't remember who else there is. And they zoom in on that. But Hillman is not writing about quantum physics. He's not writing about cosmology. He's not writing about Nietzsche. He's not writing about, I don't know, sort of the novels. I mean, you'll enjoy the Daemon, because I think of all the books I've written, the Daemon is the one I enjoyed the most, and it's the one Amanda has read, because it's literature most of the daemon is literature. So I cite, for instance, a lot of James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake. I have a whole thing on Finnegan's Wake. I have Flann O'Brien. I discuss Waiting for Godot. And
all Irish so far, isn't it, Tony?
Is what?
All Irish so far, isn't it?
It is. They all seem to be quite interested in the kind of the eternal return, the eternal recurrence. Because as you know, in Finnegan's Wake is a pun. Finn again awake. So it's a pun of the fact that Finn has died and is re-alive again. And if you read Finnegan's Wake, the first line of the novel is a continuation of the last line.
You're not talking about Ulysses here, are you?
No, it's definitely Finnegan's Wake.
Right. Because Ulysses as well is the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah. But does Ulysses start with in Vickers around the Hill of Hoyth to something or other? I don't think I'm confusing the two. Finnegan's Wake is the one that's used in all the archaic language, isn't it?
I've heard the only James Joyce I've read actually is a portrait of the artist as a young man. So that's the one. Okay,
I think I'm right in the sense I'm sure it's Finnegan's Wake.
I've looked at Ulysses and I'm just thinking, and I've obviously read about it, and that's what they usually cite rather than Finnegan's Wake. But maybe
right. Ulysses is one day, isn't it? The life of Bloom wandering around Dublin. And his affair with Nora Barnacle and everything else. I think he started with the kind of playing with language in Ulysses, because Ulysses obviously is playing on the Greek myth of Ulysses as well. But Finnegan's Wake is a much more, it's real stream of consciousness. It's very like, the only other novelist I think is similar is probably Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, which is that stream of consciousness, like To the Lighthouse, what she was doing. But it's the idea of circularity. It's the idea of living your life over and over again, and doing it again.
So my daemon perhaps has left it until now, because this is the opportune moment for me to go and get it and read it.
Yeah, I think you'd enjoy, particularly as an English graduate. I mean, bringing you in again, Amanda, you've read it. What's your thoughts on it?
Oh gosh, it's a long time ago now since I read it, but one of the things that stayed with me was the stories about precognition and how they were really interesting, especially the story about the a plane, I seem to remember, plane at the fair. We were talking about this on the phone the other day.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
There's two things, actually. One of the things, after I wrote the daemon, I was contacted by, and this, you won't know about this either, this will be news to you, this story. I was contacted by a university lecturer, who I won't name his name because, he has academic credibility, but he was born with a call over him. And within Celtic tradition, if you're born with a call, you have the gift of second sight. Mm-hmm. And he has had visions all his life and precognitive dreams. And he contacted me and he explained one of his precognitive dreams, which is extraordinary. Okay. He's in a dream and he's in a hotel room. And he walks across the hotel room and looks out of the window of the hotel. As he does so, he sees the Concorde go past with its tail on fire. He sees Concorde crash, flames everywhere. Then he hears people going through him, speaking to each other in German. Now, because he speaks German, he could understand what the people were saying in the dream, and they were saying, my God, what's happened? What's happened? This is awful. He then wakes up and he realizes it was a precognitive dream. And I think he realized, for the same reason that Graham Nichols realizes his precognitive dreams, we call it the cerulean effect. If a dream is tinged with blue, it tends to be precognitive. We don't know why. We're looking into this at the moment, but it seems to be the case. And we're trying to find out why at the moment. But anyway, he is so panic-stricken about this. He sends a fax to British Airways and says, a Concorde is going to crash. You must do something about it. Now, you may know that Concorde was one of the safest aircraft ever. There had never been a Concorde crash anywhere ever.
Yeah.
Then, about 2 years later, you remember Concorde crashed in Paris. It crashed in Paris, and it crashed because its tail was on fire. It kicked up some debris as it was taking off at Charles de Gaulle, or was it Orly? It might have been Orly. And it then flew in the sky, fire on, and then it crashed onto a hotel. This is exactly what my friend saw. But what gets weirder is that the people who died on the plane were German. The Concorde was positioning to New York for German people to pick up a cruise. Now, that to me is extraordinary. And I have somewhere in this house a copy of the fax that this guy sent to British Airways, saying Concorde is going to crash, and he gave all the full details. Now, to me, that is extraordinary, but not as extraordinary as the case you and I were talking about. Just again, to give a bit of background information, one of the books I wrote is, I sound like Ernie Wise, don't I? The play which I wrote. But one of the books I wrote was on J.B. Priestley. I'm fascinated by J.B. Priestley's writings on precognition, J.B. Priestley's writings on the circularity of time. But Priestley, I met J.B. Priestley's son, Tom. I was due to do an event at the National Theatre in London. I was invited to speak in front of the audience before a performance of Time and the Conways, the J.B. Priestley play. And I did the presentation, funnily enough, with Brian Cox's PhD tutor, Professor Jeff Forshaw. So it was Jeff Forshaw and myself on stage. And I needed to know a little bit more about Priestley. And I saw that Priestley's play, When We Are Married, was going to be on at the Playhouse in Liverpool. And Tom Priestley was going to be doing a talk about his father beforehand. So I went in and I met Tom. And Tom and I chatted about Cheating the Ferryman, and he thought, my father would have been really intrigued by your work. And he turned around and he said, do you know that my father received somewhere in the region of 3,000 letters after a TV program he did called Monitor in 1963 on British television? And he said, would you like me to facilitate you to have access to these letters? Because he said, my father only used about a dozen of them in his book Man and Time. The rest of them remain unread, and they're in the documents library at the University of Cambridge. So I was given the opportunity to read these letters, and I spent 2 weeks about 12 years ago reading these letters, and they're extraordinary. But one of the letters is simply the most extraordinary letter I have ever seen about a precognition. It involved a man and his wife. This letter is in my book, and many of these letters are in my book on J.B. Priestley called Time and the Rose Garden. By the way, if anybody wants to read that book, okay. In the letter, he says, and this guy describes an ordinary guy, and he's on holiday in Dorset in 1952, I think it was. He was on holiday, and on the way back, him and his wife were going to call into the Farnborough Air Show in order to watch the air show, because he was a movie buff. He liked aircraft. So this was on the Thursday night. His wife wakes up in the middle of the night and she says, we can't go to the air show. I've just had a nightmare. And he said, what happened? And he said, we were at the air show. And she said, I saw a silver aircraft fly over and it disintegrated. And part of the engines came off and hit hundreds, scores of people were killed. We can't go. I'm too scared. He says, don't be silly. It's a dream. Don't worry about it. Let's just go. So on the Friday, they go to the air show. So they're at the air show. And as they're at the air show, suddenly his wife grabs his hand and she goes, oh my God, it's that plane. And flying across them was something called the Sea Vixen, the de Havilland D110, I think it was. And it was being flown by two people, a guy called John Derry, who was a Second World War fighter test pilot, and a guy called Tony Holland. And they come over, and as the plane goes through the sound barrier, it then flies over. As it does so, he turns around to his wife and he goes, no, it's a different plane. You said the plane you saw was silver. That's black. And she said, oh my God, it is. My dream was wrong. And she was wrong, because the plane goes through the sound barrier again, circles the and lands. Nothing happened. So they get in the car and they drive back to Welwyn Garden City where they lived. They get up the next morning, and in the middle of the afternoon, there's breaking news coming through. There's been a terrible disaster at the Farnborough Air Show. 56 people have been killed. John Derry's been killed. Tony Holland has been killed. The plane disintegrated. The engine came off and it landed and killed lots of people. What is weird about this story, and if you go on to, and I suggest after you listen to this, go on to YouTube and just look it up. There's film of the plane. There's film of what happened. What happened was on the Friday night, the black version of the Sea Vixen that John Derry had flown went tech. It wasn't working properly. So Derry went back to Cardington, I think it was, where the other versions of the plane were. And he took one of the other planes that hadn't been painted. It was silver. Now, this is creepy. This means that woman saw the plane crash in a dream, but she wasn't there. She'd seen a black plane. Now, my argument is that what happened there was she had what I call a Dunn dream. I mentioned J.W. Dunn earlier on. J.W. Dunn argues that when you have precognitive dreams, you're dreaming about things you're going to come across in your future, not the events. Your brain creates around future information a dream to accommodate that information. She saw the film that you're about to see when you go on to Pathé News. And I'll guarantee she precognized seeing Pathé News a few months in advance. And that's what created her precognitive dream. Now, this means that we all precognize. And in the book, The Daemon, and I have whole sections on, I think you recall, 9/11. And how
I remember
people
this
saw.
section. Yeah.
And the idea of, for instance, again, if anybody's interested in precognition here, and this will blow your mind, go on to online and do a web search on Coup, C-O-U-P, and an album called Party Music. Look at that album cover. It's 9/11. It's the Twin Towers. There's an explosion on one side. There's flames coming out of it and everything.
Same angle.
Even the same angle, isn't it, Tim? It's extraordinary. And you then discover that cover was designed in March of 2001. It was about to be released, and they pulled it. Not only that, but another album cover by a band called Dream Theater, called Scenes from New York, came out on September the 11th. The day the planes crashed in. You look at that album cover, you see the Twin Towers covered in flames. The lyrics of the album, they have things like Strange Deja Vu, Precognitive Dreaming. These are the songs on the album. And in the background, you hear sirens. Exactly the sounds.
Mum dreamed about 9/11. We've had precognitive dreams in the family for generations. And my grandmother had them, my mum had them, I have them. I've never had them tinged in blue, and neither has my mum. But she was dreaming about aircraft disasters a lot. I think I told you this in our group.
Yeah, please go on.
She dreamed about 9/11, and that was when her dreams stopped. And interestingly, when hers stopped, mine really began in earnest. So it's almost as if the baton gets passed down. It's strange. But yeah, she had them for many years, and she dreamed about 9/11. I think I told you. And then I dreamed about Fukushima while it was happening, if you remember. I mentioned that at the Walker group meeting as well. And it was dreams that led me to go to France as well. It was all about how the dreams were leading me in certain directions, which, brings me back to this idea about how these things pass down in families. There is a genetic component to all of this, which I've studied as well, as you know. And so the question that I have really is, you said earlier on that we all have precognition, but some people don't appear to have it switched on. And why does it operate in some ways? Like, for example, I remember in your book, some people have precognition and they listen and they avoid the disasters, like in the Titanic or in 9/11. But other people, they have the precognition and they don't listen, and then they die. Now, is that their destiny? Is that their fate? You know, I'm studying a lot of Ingo Swann at the moment. He's one of my favorite, you know, kind of CIA psychics, and he talks in his books about the difference between destiny and fate. So do you have a theory about this? Like, if we have a particular destiny to fulfill, is it some people's destiny to die in these accidents, or would you say that that's an accident because they're not listening to their daemon or their higher self?
Well, it's an excellent question, but if the daemon knows that we have multiple iterations of this life, it doesn't really matter, because if you die in that disaster, you're going to go back to your and be born again, and this time round, the daemon will try and make sure that you're not there again and try and save you. You remember in the book, I have a whole section on Joan of Arc, and the way in which Joan of Arc's daemon, the voice, got very frustrated with her because Joan deliberately went out of her way to be captured and didn't listen to the voice and ended up being burned at the stake. Now, there's two arguments here. Either the daemon allows you to do it because it wants to go back and have another go, or you only die in other people's iterations. Because remember I said that everybody is perceived, we are all collectively creating this, and everybody's living their individual lives within what I call their phanerons. And then there's the collective unconscious. But in other people's phanerons, you won't die. You know, it might be that, you know, you might exist in a world where you don't die. For instance, one of the things people say, the major criticism people have, and it's a reasonable one, of Cheating the Ferryman is, if you're born as yourself over and over again, what happens to children who are born disabled, or babies that die very young? Are they doomed to just have that all the time? And my answer is no. The answer is a simple one. Cheating the Ferryman suggests not only is your universe and your outcomes of your life dependent upon your decisions, but also the decisions of all your ancestors. All your ancestors have made decisions. You know, if my grandmother had not been ill, I'd have been born in Tasmania. There's a version of me that would have lived in Tasmania. It's still me. And there will be versions of those children who will exist in universes where there was a cure for that congenital illness they had. And that's where they will gravitate towards. So they'll be in a universe which will facilitate their survival, because that's how it works. In which case, we see the sadness of people dying here with congenital illnesses, but there will be another universe where that child won't. There will be another universe where the children that died at Aberfan will not. I mean, again, in the book, I have sections of Aberfan, the children who...
The little girl that had a precog dream, told her mother.
Yeah.
Sadly, she was sent to school.
Yeah, Errol May Jones.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Errol May Jones, she begged her mother to not go to school. She said, and she turned around and she said, I can't go to school because me and the children will be covered in blackness.
In which case, Tony, right, theoretically, if you've got this great, just coming to my head, if you've got this greater daemon, right, then why weren't they working together? When the child's daemons have given this girl the precog dream, why isn't the daemon giving the mother some intuitive idea that she's right?
Good point. And I don't know. You would think. But then again, the problem is, as I say in the daemon, and I say in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, that it depends on how effective the channels of communication between the daemon, between demonic mind and eidolonic mind are available. Some of us, our daemons can't speak to us. Some of us can scream at us. Daemons can communicate in so many different ways, but they are trapped in how they can communicate with us. And I believe it depends on how developed your daemon is to be able to communicate.
In my philosophy, we would say that would come about as a result of past lives as well. You know, and also genetics, because when we look at people like Stephen Hawking, you'll remember when he had the God helmet put on him by Persinger, there was no reaction at all. His brain did not respond to that stimulation. He had no mystical experience or no God experience. And when I learned about that experiment, I realized that some people just don't have the hardware, you know, to receive this information. It's just not there. And we can't fix it. And I think different people have different purposes here in existence. And people like him, they don't have the mystical, he might put it down simply to genetics, and I think genetics does play a part, but some people just don't have that, do they? It seems like.
It does seem to be the case that, that for some people I know, the daemon is imminent. Like, for instance, our mutual friend, Myron Dial. Myron's daemon has been with him since he was 4 years of age and is a regular part of his life, communicates with him regularly. And this is because Myron experiences temporal lobe epilepsy. And in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I have what I call the Huxleyan spectrum. And the Huxleyan spectrum is a kind of a continuum of how the doors of perception open wider and wider depending upon your neurology. So, for instance, if you are a neurotypical, your doors of perception are closed. Your daemon may be able to communicate, maybe in dreams, maybe in hunches, but it can't really communicate powerfully. Then you get to what I have, classic migraine. When you have classic migraine, the daemon can kind of talk to you sometimes, can kind of get through. Then as the doors get wider, you have temporal lobe epilepsy. You have schizophrenia. You have autism. You have Alzheimer's. You have Gershwin syndrome. All of these are the doors open in different ways. Now, I'd argue, for instance, that somebody who has autism, their doors of perception are open in a very different way. They are able to access the irregular way of thinking that the daemon can do, how the daemon can access memory, how it can access synesthesia, these kind of things. Now, again, if anybody's new to this program, something that you really need to check in terms of this is roll back through the interviews I've done and check out the interview myself and Sarah did with Rebecca Sharrock, who is one of only 8 people in the world who has superior autobiographical memory. She remembers everything in her life, including her dreams, including being in the womb. We tested her live on radio, live on the program like this. We were broadcasting live, and I realized we could test her. And I knew that Rebecca really liked the Harry Potter novels. So what I got Sarah to do, because Sarah has a young daughter, has the Harry Potter novels, and I said, okay, Sarah, go off, pick one of the books at random, and just pick a page at random and read it and see if Rebecca can finish it. Sarah, random, started a page. She read, I think it was 6 words. Rebecca finished the paragraph. Is
Rebecca autistic or?
Oh yeah, she's autistic. No, she's autistic.
Yeah.
It's the most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed. And if anybody says that this is nonsense, watch that and you tell me how extraordinary that is. This is why science has to be looking into these things, because they are real. People have these skills. And to be in denial of them because it doesn't fit in with your science is bad science. That's scientism. It's not science.
Can I make 2 things quickly, Tony?
Yep.
One is, I wonder if you asked her about prenatal dreaming, first of all. That would be fascinating, because what constitutes a prenatal dream, right? And the second thing is, Wayne's been in touch, and I'm reminded about asking his question if we have time.
Okay, because we'll have to finish in probably about 10 minutes. So very quickly, prenatal dreaming. Yes, there is evidence of prenatal dreaming because we know that the baby's dreaming in the womb. And in the final chapter of Cheating the Ferryman, you may recall I had a section on babies dreaming in the womb, because I was very intrigued by this, because what are they dreaming about? What can they possibly be dreaming about? And I think they dream about their past life. What they're doing is, I think there's an overlap. There's something called neonatalism. And neonatalism, again, in another of my books, I think it was Opening the Doors of Perception, I discussed this with regards to my own mother. Neonatalism, a guy called Barry Rensburg, who was an American neurologist. And he has diagrams that shows that as somebody goes into Alzheimer's, they literally physiologically go backwards. They start to move in different ways. They start to go into a fetal position. But I tested this on my mother. This is extraordinary. Something else that only newborn babies have is something called a Babinski reflex, which is when you tickle the bottom of the foot, it curls inwards or backwards. When my mother was dying of Alzheimer's, I tested it on her feet. Her Babinski reflex was of an embryo.
Yeah.
It's because she was an embryo. Her two lives are overlapping at that stage, where the one life is coming to an end, and this is proof again of cheating the ferryman. The one life is coming to an end, and the two consciousnesses are overlapping. One is in the womb, and one is in a bed dying. So what I'm suggesting is that the babies are dreaming in the same way that somebody towards the end of their life are dreaming. And neonatalism is evidence of this. So that's what I believe is taking place. So very much, again, Wayne's question.
Yeah, Wayne's question. I'll have to read it, Tony. So here we go. Hang on, let me get it. Trawling through all the notes I've made. Right, here we go. I'll read it better than the previous thing I read out. Would eternal recurrence be a form of hell in that we never truly die, but relive our lives with all their pains and sufferings, and is therefore a closed system, even if we get to change certain decisions? In this sense, the cheating the ferryman hypothesis is just another form of materialism.
Well, it's a very good point, in that, to me, materialism, my hypothesis is materialistic, in the sense that I use materialistic reductionist science to put my arguments across. So I have no problem with modern materialist reductionist science, because without materialist reductionist science, we wouldn't be communicating now. We couldn't do it. So science is very, very effective at that. Do I believe that cheating the ferryman is a closed loop? No, I don't. Because remember, you've got to go back to the point, and it's a very important point, and you pointed out before, Thomson's lamp. Yeah. You know, the idea of, and the same is with time. They're working now on the idea of quantum time, that time is quantized in exactly the same way. So it means there's the smallest bit of time you can possibly have. So there's going to be a point where, when smaller and smaller bits of time that you live your life over and over again, there'll be a point where there'll be no more time available to you. And that's when you die. That's when you move on. So all this happens within a microsecond. All these myriads of lives just happen at the end of one life. You're not dead. And this is the important point when people say there's no proof of life after death. In Cheating the Ferryman, I don't need to prove life after death. Everything happens in a living body. You know, that's why materialist reductionist scientists and skeptics have problems with my work, because I can knock them down. They'll turn around and say, you believe in life after death. I don't. My model happens in a living body. It doesn't happen in a dead brain. It happens in a live brain. So I don't ever have to try to go to the non-materialist idea of spirituality and we're all spirit and everything else, because I argue that spirit is the same as matter, is the same as the mathematical structure of reality. That everything in the final analysis is data. Everything is data. Everything is non-physical information. It's information. So therefore, when we talk about matter and non-matter, or matter and spirituality, dualism, there isn't. We have matter and spirituality, but at a deeper level, it's the same thing. The basis of all of it is information. And information is non-physical.
Well, could that information be consciousness?
Yes. Consciousness, because if consciousness is what collapses the wave function, consciousness is what processes that information to create the external reality that we perceive. And this is why people are always talking about the holographic universe. This is what is meant by the holographic universe. And it's all to do with black holes. It's all to do with information. And it's really, really intriguing, and it works. This is the thing, that if anybody really carefully reads Cheating the Ferryman, the model actually works. And it works without needing any movement outside of theoretical science. I believe that there is more, but I can't prove it. But there's nothing but theoretical science in Cheating the Ferryman. Every single thing I say in there is referenced back to academic papers and scientific theory. Absolutely everything. Right, on that, I'm aware that we're about to come to an end. That was terrific, guys. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Yeah. Can I just say, Tony, can I just say one little thing quickly?
Yeah.
just because it could be just this little poetic idea to finish. The greater Edelan, that sum of all the Edelans becomes like the universal mind in reincarnation. The sum of all the daemons becomes the spirit soul. They talk about reincarnation. I'm not a believer in reincarnation, but it could be that the daemon is actually the thing that carries on, and gives us our new experiences in the forthcoming worlds we live in.
I think that's true. Amanda, would you like to make any final comments?
Only that I do believe in reincarnation, and I've had things that I've experienced verified scientifically as well. Same as Susan Laybourne, we've both had experiences which show some kind of something, where that's come from, we don't really know, but neither of us were looking for it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, well, I think that if you look deeply into Cheating the Ferryman, whether Cheating the Ferryman's explanation of your experiences is the correct explanation is, I don't know. But Cheating the Ferryman can explain if there is an information field and the information field can tune into the Uberdaemon, and the Uberdaemon contains the history of every single human being that's ever lived, then we do have past lives. And we can tune into past lives. And that's what we do tune into when we have memories of living in certain times and certain places. Because again, we need to revert back again to the trap of linear time. The idea that the Albigenesian heresy took place in 1222 or whatever. It's happening now. There's levels of time and they're like layers of an onion. There is no flow of time. It's a continual now, as Eckhart Tolle says. Time is not what it seems at all. People will turn around and say it's thermodynamics, and it's just things going from high energy to low energy, entropy. Yeah, but that's entropy. That's not time.
Yeah. It's
a measurement device. Like a clock measures geometry. It doesn't mention time. It measures geometry. Time is the only thing that is measured by itself. You can have a pound of apples. You can only ever have a minute of a minute. And I've no way of knowing that my minute is the same as your minute, because we can never tell. We can never argue.
Arthur Gurdon is a psychiatrist who I talk about a lot, who was an atheist and very reductionist thinker, but his own experiences with patients who were allegedly mentally ill led him to the awareness that, in his opinion, reincarnation was a real thing. And I've spoken about him before, but he says most psychic experiences happen outside of time, and he speaks a lot about timelessness. And he also talks in his books about children who experience what he calls far memory. So they have memories from 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, we know from other scientists and psychologists who studied this that they have these memories born in them. Susan remembered being a Jewish woman when she was about 4 years old. And then later on, through some of the research we were doing together, she actually found the Holocaust records of the name that she remembers. So there's so many mysteries in all of this.
And this is what makes it. This is what makes it so wonderful, isn't it? And this is why we cannot have closed minds. The answers to the mysteries are there once we just take what the information is telling us, rather than saying, I don't accept that because it doesn't fit in with my science. My argument has always been, be as open-minded as you possibly can, because that's where information lies. If you just reinforce your own beliefs, you're never going to get anywhere. Because if we'd done that, we'd have never have evolved out of the caves, would we? And for instance, at the 1890s, some of the claims made by the scientists in the 1890s that they only needed to calculate to another 6 decimal points because they knew everything. And then in 1901, along came Max Planck, 1900, came along and threw everything away, and proved the quantum universe. So it's important. And we live in very exciting times. And I think, as you and I have discussed. Right. Okay. I'm aware of time, everybody. Thank you for listening in, everybody. some really great. And I've noticed Alden Kenobi has pointed out Bill Hicks. Yes, we're all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. Now over to Bill with the news. Yeah, absolutely. Tom with the news, I think it was. And thanks to everybody that listened in there. I'm just looking at some of the names down there, sort of Dave Warman, Ralph Winter, Roger Braintree, all you guys. Thank you very much for listening in. It's been really enjoyable. Please let people know about this as well. I know that we deserve a much broader audience than we're getting at the moment. And it's just a matter of people knowing about it. And the only way people can know about it is if you tell people about it. You know, I'm not a famous writer or anything else. I'm just an ordinary guy and I can't do it all on my own. So I need your help. So if these ideas resonate and you want to carry them forward, let's get them out there. You know, please help me if you can. And thanks again to my two wonderful interrogators. It's been, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, and I definitely didn't get the Spanish Inquisition today, which was absolutely perfect. I don't know which one could have been Torquemada, but we'll hopefully assume maybe it was Amanda with her blood red top and things, possibly. But thank you, everybody, and we'll see you all again soon. But thanks for listening in. Okay, bye-bye.
Hey.